Huh? Okay, so Sara is originally from Australia, interdisciplinary artist, interested in the scientific method and its philosophical implications. And among many other things, she collaborated with scientists from MIT, NASA, NIST, and so on. And the resulting work has been exhibited internationally. My introduction is notoriously very brief, but if you go to lasertalks.com, you'll find the extended bio and a link to their websites. All yours.
Thank you. Okay.
Microphone.
Oh, it's on? Not high enough? You can hear?
No.
You sure? I think that's, yeah, I can hear it, so good. Okay, hello, my name is Sara Morawetz. It's really lovely to be here with you this evening. Thank you so much for having me. Over the last decade, my artistic and theoretical research has examined the entanglement of conceptual art practice and scientific enterprise, exploring ideas of transference between the visual, the theoretical, and the abstract. It is my belief that conceptual art, which emerged as a dominant force in the 20th century, is possessed of a fundamentally propositional, methodological, and experimental character, one that is indicative of an employment and exploitation of scientific procedure and philosophy. It is with this view that I approach both my academic and visual practice. To lean upon the words of Deleuze, what I'm interested in are the relationships between the arts, science, and philosophy. There are no order of priority among these disciplines. Each is creative. The true object of science is to create functions. The true object of art is to create sensory aggregates. And the object of philosophy is to create concepts. From this viewpoint, given these general heads, however sketchy, of function, aggregate, and concept, we can pose the question of echoes and resonances between them. How is it possible, in their completely different lines of development, with quite different rhythms and movements of production, how is it possible for a concept, an aggregate, and function to interact? As a conceptual artist with a research-based interdisciplinary practice, my work reflects critically and poetically on the matter and methods of science. I'm interested in the systems and structures that science has used to construct, define, and measure our experiences of the world, and how such systems can at once convey precision, accuracy, and determinacy, yet remain slippery, speculative, and whimsical when tested in the field. My work approaches art, science, and philosophy as an active, complex, and entangled ecology, one that requires perpetual redefinition and testing through experimental parameters. As such, I tend to develop work within an experimental framework, one that involves a unique hypothesis, a performative methodology, and a system of data collection, generating experimental results that encompass not only the original action, but lead to a range of performative artifacts that, as Christine Stahl suggests, extend the implicit temporality experienced in the now, beyond the now, to the after now. My work routinely draws upon scientific concepts as well as the history and philosophy of science to find its form. I lean on science as one would lean on a tool. It provides a way of thinking and a mode of working, a set of rules that, as an artist, I can adopt, eschew, and redetermine without being beholden to the rigors of reproducibility and account. As I came to understand my own methodological regard for scientific material, the more I recognize a network of historical conceptual practitioners that work similarly, occasionally getting acknowledged for such endeavors, such as Marcel Duchamp's exposition of non-Euclidean geometry that produced the theoretically credible yet functionally redundant three standard stoppages. But more often than not, I would encounter experimental adaptations, such as this work by John Baldessari, that are not typically discussed as adaptations of experimental methods. While such works are obviously not serving any scientific purpose, I would argue that these kinds of conceptual projects embody a scientific character, stridently embracing the ideas of an experimental test, whilst replicating and subverting scientific methods of representation. Similarly is true for figures such as Mel Bochner, whose work and writing reveal an intrinsic knowledge of scientific method and philosophy, and who routinely coded scientific mechanisms into his visual and written forms. When speaking of his measurement series that was developed during his residency at the Singer Laboratories in 1968, where he participated in think tank-style discussions with mathematicians and physicists who were investigating new forms of computational and aerospace technology, he said the work came from a desire to understand, and I quote, How do scientists translate their research into more concrete applications? How do they design experiments? The nature of colour as a type of energy, the fundamental difference between the analogue and the digital. How do scientists, and in a broader sense people, know what they know?" End quote. As an artist, I am similarly drawn to these fundamentals, the mechanics of what science is, how science operates, and how in turn these operational shifts shape the way we see and know the world around us. A sentiment most eloquently expressed by social theorist John Culkin: "We shape our tools and thereafter our tools shape us." And it is this notion more than any other I strive to articulate within my practice. Tonight I'll be talking about two works that contemplate the measurement of time in this context. These works, How the Stars Stand, a performative engagement of time as experienced on Mars, and 61 on 60, a lifelong action documenting the occurrence of leap seconds, which both emerged from an interdisciplinary exchange with emeritus NASA scientist Dr. Michael Allison. I met Michael in a cafe in New York's Upper West Side in early 2014. Michael, who was involved in the original determination of systems of timekeeping for bodies outside our own planet, was also a science fiction geek, well versed in the works of Ray Bradbury. And somehow, in amongst our discussions of the hard science associated with the definitions of time and systems of timekeeping, I found my understanding of time's rigidity softening. Michael casually suggested that the Earth's second just isn't quite long enough, and the utility of time is only as useful to the epoch in which it is tied. That, for example, the NASA team operating rovers on the Martian surface were better served winding their clocks according to time on Mars rather than accounting for time on Earth, for their workday was dictated by the Martian sunrise and in no way tethered to the passage of time on Earth. In talking with Michael, it occurred to me, as it had not before, that time is not a fixed, immutable construct, but rather an accounting that flexes and yields to place and context. The metric of time operates as an elusive and invisible constraint, indexing both orbital mechanics of planetary motion as well as a desire for measured experience. I propose that within these outer bounds of the perception of time, where time is stretched beyond routine physical and philosophical engagement, art offers an invaluable space for experimental investigation, and I present my works How the Stars Stand and 61 on 60 in this context. How the Stars Stand is a durational action that was conceived to test the natural divergence of interplanetary time. For the duration of the performance, I abandoned time on Earth and instead lived by time as experienced on Mars, affecting a 2.7% lengthening of my day, making each day 24 hours, 39 minutes, and 35 seconds as when measured according to time on Earth. The performance was staged in open source gallery in Brooklyn, New York, where I lived, worked, and slept on site, maintaining Martian hours for all daily activities, including gallery opening hours. With each day of the performance, my time would shift against the experience of time on Earth, and the performative framework was designed to exhaust this motion, allowing my day to gradually separate from earthbound standards and to completely invert, and then slowly return to synchronicity, an action taking 37 days or 36 Martian sols to complete. As a means of archiving the slow temporal shift of my time against time occurring on Earth, I marked each day with a self-portrait that was taken at precisely 9 a.m. on Mars. While this action was maintained at a constant time for me, the cumulative effects of my shifting time against Earth were seen in the variance of light around me and the divergence of time on the two clocks maintained on the wall. The effect of moving to a time outside Earth's solar cycle whilst remaining on Earth was perhaps more profound than one might initially expect, as it requires a willful defiance of temporal experiences and to live in a perpetual state of jet lag where time is kept in motion. No day is the same as the one before, and there is no external sight to ground your experience of time other than the time the clock is telling you. In my interaction with my audience, I began to recognize how deeply time is coded, not only into our visual and audio receptors through the shifting of light and the sound of experiential spaces, but how these markers are also grained into our collective physicality through our stance, our walk, our cadence of speech. I began to read time in people's bodies and feel the effect of my own disengagement, creating a physical, philosophical, and emotional state of dissonance that was at worst during complete inversion when I was going to bed at sunrise and waking up at sunset. In an effort to archive such experiences, I wrote a series of letters to NASA questioning the nature of our experience of time and diary entries such as the following. It's day, it's night, it's something in between. Does time even matter anymore? You move forward, you move back. You are propelled by measures you are no longer marking. Your hope turns on a dime, it quivers and dissipates. You are once again restless, anxious, and uncomfortable. And as energy morphs into listlessness and your emotions ricochet, the inexorable march of the clock ticks on and on and on, regardless. You want this to be over now. You're tired of waking in darkness and sleeping through light. You're tired of documenting and being documented. You, I measure as I measure time, becomes an indictment on your character. You no longer measure up. Time's got the better of you. You don't know what things look like or what they mean. Just what exactly are you, a human clock, an occupier of time? You check your watch incessantly, but never seem to quite know what the time is. Is that success or failure? What is this now as I look at my watch? You generally consider giving up. You're tired and kind of over it. You're not sure this crazy thing is worth it. The isolation gets to you, as does the constant accounting for time. Time often passes and nothing happens, yet every second passed is a second wasted, 1 second longer than the other, and that one cuts the deepest. An hour passes, 2. Time no longer counted by a clock or by light, but instead by a series of transitions. Another routine based on action. The system isn't gone, it's just replaced with another. Time drifts past dreamlessly and you feel suspended. You understand the end is closer now, but not close enough to count on yet. Although it felt at one point it may never happen, slowly but surely my time began to realign itself, first bringing daylight, then full synchronization, which occurred at 6 p.m. on day 37, sol 36 of the performance. It was a moment met with celebration and utter exhaustion. In the aftermath of the physical action, the daily photographs and the letters to NASA have been exhibited in multiple forms. In a singularity as a set of letters and photographs, alongside artifacts from the performance, such as the clocks and watches that kept time, and a series of performance ephemera that I collected as the performance occurred. Additionally, the work has been documented in written form through the creation of pseudoscientific papers that adapt the structure, tone, and evaluative tools customarily applied to formal scientific writing and analysis. While I obviously can't share the entirety of the paper in this context, I thought I would share one of the work's definitions that embodies the process. Definition 1, performative time. Let performative time be what is measured by a clock, but let that clock measure time differently, an interval of elsewhere that makes time a constant variable. May time be unfastened from the Earth's rotation and instead be a function of a real yet unseen experience, a night and day that occurs 55 million kilometers away, concurrent yet irrelative to our own. Let this time be measured and measured again, compared, calculated, consciously at the center of everything, yet inevitably slipping away. Let time pivot, lapse, and reset. Let it drift in and out. Let time be everywhere and nowhere at all. While How the Stars Stand is a performative action designed to evaluate the expression of time as measured beyond our fixed vantage point, my second work, 61 on 60, seeks to turn the same form of inquiry inward, to examine how the operational construct of earthbound time sits in tension, if not outright opposition, to the planetary body that gave it form. For the motion of the Earth and its relationship to the Sun is not constant. The Earth is in fact slowly slowing down. Its rate of rotation about its own axis is faltering, leading to a gradual lengthening of our solar day. Such dynamics imply a fundamental ambiguity. What do we mean when we speak of time? Is it fixed, invariant quantity, unyielding and universal, or is it a heliocentric metric, bound to our passage around the Sun? 61 on 60 was created in order to consider this schism, operating as a performative action to examine the leap second, a quantum of time irregularly added to our global clock to ensure that it remains in sync with our Sun. Since its introduction, the leap second, introduction in 1972, 27 leap seconds have been added, resulting in 27 minutes that span the time of not 60 seconds, but 61. Thus far, no 59-second minutes have been required, although we may not be far off. 61 on 60 creates a 1 second performative action coincident with each leap second's introduction. In each installment, I position myself with a pair of orchestral cymbals in a demarcated area and await the new second's arrival. The performance occurs between 23, 59, 60 to 61, with the cymbals being struck at the moment of the 61st second. Each iteration is performed with a new pair of cymbals that are only struck once and then subsequently retired, thus holding the resonance of this new 61st second ad infinitum. The first iteration of this series was staged in Times Square, New York City, coincident with the introduction of the 26th leap second on June 30, 2015, at precisely 19:59, 60 to 61 Eastern Daylight Time. The second iteration was staged at Lick Observatory in Mount Hamilton, concurrent with the introduction of the 27th leap second on December 31st, 2016, at precisely 15:59, 60 to 61 Pacific Standard Time. The work is formulated to continue in this fashion, subject to the rulings of International Earth's Rotation and Reference System, the IERS, staged only when the Earth tarries sufficiently in its orbit for a new leap second to be called forth and inserted into time. In humble recognition of the planetary timescales that underpin the work's premise, the performance has been conceived as a lifelong action, one that will simultaneously be the shortest and longest work that I ever undertake. This durational framework was considered and conceptually motivated choice, an acknowledgement that if one wants to work with the temporal motions of the planets, one must be willing to give all the time you have to give. In the vastness of such time frames, even this remains a laughably insufficient gesture. But I hope that this extension can still be recognized as the fullest extent that a human can possibly offer. By electing to bind a performative work to a planetary operation, some personal challenges are presented that ultimately require an expansive and philosophical approach. I have no control over when or indeed if a performative action will occur. Following the quick succession of the 26th and 27th leap second, I've entered a prolonged period of waiting that has lasted more than 7 years and is continuing as I speak in this moment. It is thus necessary to accept the inherent asymmetry of such a collaboration. While my time frame for this work is limited to the duration of my lifetime, this passage is but an infinitesimal speck in the arc of Earth's temporal history. With this in mind, I elect to define the work not just by its physical action, but also through the conscious and performed action of waiting, an observation of time and the way time will continue to come to change it. And so another definition is written as an expression of this gesture. Definition: waiting. Let waiting be defined as every second that is not the performative action. The second prior to the performative action is waiting, as is the second directly after. The duration of which we must wait is defined by the seconds that occur between those 2 points, also known as an interval of time. And in the interim there is waiting to be done, inactive and yet attentive, aware that every second passes brings the performative action closer. Given the task of waiting, let the sole constraint be an awareness of this fact, that it's only a matter of time until the Earth slows down. A performative action will occur in due course. Neither Earth nor Moon can be rushed. And so I end with this thought, that our perception of the Earth and its perfectly regulated system, conforming to a uniform trajectory of time and space, is something of a temporal oddity, in denial of the agency and independent motivations that all planetary bodies demonstrate. The motion of the Earth is not bound to our expectations or structure. Rather, it heeds its 2 cycles that are born of its broader dynamic. That the Earth's rotation upon its own axis and around the Sun is discordant and unyielding to our temporal manifestation should come as no surprise. The Earth does not move for us. That the structure of time presumes alliance, or at worst compliance, is a representative of our own ontological failing. That the folly of our humanistic desire to preference contextual experience. We should not expect time to be subservient to our current trajectory, or, if we do, we must accept that it is a limited metric, one that will irrevocably be tied to an arbitrary epoch, one that will, and has already, changed around it. Thank you very much.
Very nice.
So I have 2 questions. First question is, were you alone during your Mars performance?
Yes.
So how do you think your feelings would change if you had someone with you during that long period?
Yeah, so the way the work was structured was that I was allowed to leave the gallery, I was allowed to interact with the outside world, but I had to do it according to Mars time. So I could meet friends or my husband for at any stage, but we had to do it according to Mars activities. So if it was 9 o'clock at night, on Earth, but it was 7 a.m. for me, we had to have breakfast. So you had to find 24-hour diners that could accommodate, and we had to sort of arrange that sort of by my time zone. Or you could meet me in, the morning, but if it was 8 o'clock in the morning, 8 p.m. for me, we had to have wine or beer, or we had to do something sort of at an evening sort of standard. So it sort of really just shaped in that direction. However, it was really isolating and really difficult, because even in those interactions, when you're discussing things, you're so aware that your time is out of step with everybody else around you, and where you're at and how you think about time and where you're positioning your body physiologically is different. I know that NASA, NASA actually do put the scientists who are responsible for the Martian rovers onto Mars time. They actually do sort of set that up they'll do 2 cycles, and they'll only do 2 because that's at the point where they will revolt and they're like, no more, we can't do it. You actually start losing your mind. But they have, over the course of doing it through different cycles, developed systems where they do it together. They have light and sort of systems in place to try and alleviate it, because it is really emotional, and even scientists think so.
Thank you. The second question is there any special symbolism for your symbols? Yeah.
So there's always an element between, I guess, working in this sort of scientific material of the theatrical and the artistic kind of flair of a project. And I wanted something that sort of really crashed the idea of bringing in a new second, that you're piercing time itself. And the idea of having these symbols that could crash and sort of have this moment that would then resonate and hold that time was why the symbols were chosen.
So I was a mathematician.
Mm-hmm.
So in your presentation, I picked up the mathematical underlying thing, the measurement aspect of it. So you did a performance that was a 2,000-kilometer walk.
I have pictures, because
Okay.
in case it came up.
Yeah. So can you say 2 words about it, and how does it fit with your exploration of time? I mean, this is how many days was it?
So it was 112 days, 2,100 kilometers or 1,300 miles, in which I walked from Dunkirk to Barcelona, following the historical journey that defined the length of the meter. So the meter, I'm interested in these concepts of measurement because they sit between science and societal use. They have this kind of beautiful way in which the sciences communicate with everybody else. But we don't necessarily think about why they are the way they are, or how they could be different. We sort of accept them a priori. It's a sort of, I was handed the meter as a child, and I never thought about why it was that length. I just used it as a tool. And then when I found out about the history of the meter, that it was actually defined by 2 18th century French astronomers who were tasked with traversing this 10 degrees of latitude and measuring the Earth accurately for the first time, and that the meter is in fact 1/10,000,000th of a quadrant of the Earth. That is what the metric was built on. It just struck me as this beautiful human gesture. It's incredibly profoundly based on where we are and what our world is and how we relate to it. So I decided that I would walk that distance and remeasure the Earth for myself. So I staged the walk across France, and I created a system in collaboration with my husband, who is a mathematician. So the mathematics he is my constant collaborator in all of this work. We created a system using GPS and a laser rangefinder and a theatrical target. And if you take 2 points on the Earth's surface and measure the distance between them using the Haversine equation, you can actually get an estimate of the Earth's size. I did this 108 times over the 112 days. Averaging that, I created a length which is my meter.
But now you told me something interesting. So what is the role of your husband in your art?
Yeah, so he is always listed as my scientific collaborator in the work. I usually come to him with this idea. This was a perfect example in which I said I wanted to walk the distance across France, and I wanted to measure the Earth. And I was like, how do we do this as a kind of construct of how can I do this in a way that is light, easy, and capable of being carried whilst walking? Because the original system used these wonderful brass border circles, which was a big endeavor. It took them 7 years to do. So he's incredibly creative and helpful in that regard. We talk through the problem and work out a solution that is possible to achieve.
Okay, and he sees it just as a funny thing to do, or does he see a contribution to his mathematics?
He's definitely he's definitely a collaborator and definitely loves the process. I mean, it's all of our conversations are art and science. He's a computational mathematician. He works in fluid dynamics. I know way more about fluid dynamics than any artist ever would know. I can look at a mesh and tell you how well it's optimized. Kind of wild. But we have these kind of conversations backwards and forwards, and so we try and collaborate or communicate our work to each other. I always ask really out there weird questions, such as, how can I measure the Earth, or can we create a timetable for what, to sync of time on Earth and Mars, so I can sort of plan out my day over 37 days. But that's the nature of it. He's very involved and very helpful. He was supposed to be here tonight, but unfortunately he was feeling
excellent.
well.
So really very close art-science collaboration. Any questions? Yeah.
So it looks like you're always picking this project, which is cross space and also time. And is there any you seems to have this inclination to do that? And how do you kind of pick up anything? Is it by random? You just happen to encounter this project, or you're actually thinking you want to make something have certain meanings? It has to be long, and it has to be from several different places, and you combine them.
No, it's a good question. It's actually, it's almost the opposite. It's the idea comes to me. I read something will come up, and the work forms around that. So I just read about the history of the meter and made the work to respond to that. And the nature of the work, they're not always performative. They usually have some kind of performative element, but it's really conceptually responsive. So I set up a hypothesis and I test it. So it's very much and what the idea is going to be is really hard to say, but it's always something to do with these kind of weird edges where science doesn't sit with its use or the way we think that it works. So often I have a whole suite of works that are about measurement, because I think that's kind of a really nice spot to think about it, but I'm also interested in cartography, in star mapping, a range of topics that kind of just, it's how we perceive what we see through the lens of science, and how that maybe isn't necessarily how things are, or how they could be different if we've shifted our perception just a little.
Maybe I'll just say it without, but are there any projects that you've tried but haven't worked out how you thought that they would in kind of a spectacular way, where there's a new finding from that?
Everything has an element of failure to it, absolutely. I guess I didn't know whether I would, I didn't know when I set out to live on Mars time that I would make it. And it definitely wasn't pretty the whole way through. Like you see the pictures and it looks fine. I was breaking down most days in the gallery, and people would walk in and I'm in tears and sort of going, I just need to sleep, or it's just really disorienting. I think in the way that I try and set up the work as an experiment, I think a lot about the method beforehand. There's a lot of kind of I try and set it up like you would a scientific experiment, to sort of really try and think through the consequences. But then it rolls out, and I have no control. So, what happens. And I do have, there's a weird relationship with what I want it to be and what it is, and learning to kind of let that be. For the walk across France, I talk a lot about that as well, that this idea of what I wanted it to be and what it is are very different things, but I don't know if I could change. Whether what I wanted is actually what it should have been is another question. Sort of holding that that in an experiment you just test it and you have to live with the results. And sure, I can test it again and maybe try and incrementally improve, but there's something in that kind of tension of not knowing.
Piero, this is a good segue to your talk.
Along those same lines, as Sara mentioned, it's almost like designing a project is almost like designing an experiment and having this interest in the scientific method. One of the aspects of experiments being that they're replicable. have you ever replicated one of your projects or considered replicating it, and do you feel like the experience would be different if you performed it again?
I would absolutely do Mars again, but it needs such specific parameters. You need to find a gallery that's really willing to let you live in the space. I would tweak it based on the experiences that I had and what sort of trying to push it further or see kind of reimagine it a little. I think the interesting thing, I guess, with art, the idea of reproducibility is kind of like a weird idea. It's never going to be reproducible because it is in the world. And I honestly think that there's a lot of truth in that in science as well, that we just don't like to talk about, that it's quite subjective, it's human, there's so much that's emotional, and that's kind of what I'm trying to get to as an artist, that you see science slightly differently as a human construct, created by humans, for humans, enacted, and the imperfections make it, or kind of where we know those parameters are or boundaries are, is the interesting part. So there are definitely works that kind of have repetitions, and I have a series of works called All My Failures, where I do it a month at a time and I record every failure that I make in a kind of public document. And it's a repetition, I guess it's the same experiment conducted over and over again, but obviously the conditions change based on time and space that I'm in. But that's sort of, yeah, it's definitely something I think about.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you.